You know Rome. You know Greece. You know Egypt, Babylon, the Vikings, the Mongols. If someone mentions the ancient world, these are the names that come to mind. But there is one empire that most people outside of Asia have never properly heard the full story of. An empire that, in a single generation, did something that Rome took centuries to attempt and never fully achieved. An empire that unified an entire civilization, its language, its currency, its roads, its laws, its very measurements, under one man, one system, one vision. And the man who built it is one of the most fascinating, most brilliant, and most terrifying rulers in all of human history. His name was Qin Shi Huang. And if you have not heard his full story, you are about to understand why everything you think you know about ancient power is incomplete without it. Here is the thing about Qin Shi Huang that most people do not know. He laid the foundations of a political and administrative system that China would build on for the next 2,000 years. And he was also a man who ordered the burning of almost every book in China, who had hundreds of scholars buried alive, who sent 700,000 workers to build his tomb, and had them killed when it was finished, so nobody could reveal where the entrance was, who spent the last years of his life drinking liquid mercury because his court alchemists told him it would make him immortal, and later died from mercury poisoning on a road trip searching for the elixir of eternal life. The man built the foundation of China simultaneously, and make sure he destroyed everything China had ever been before him. That contradiction is the story, and it starts not with a great battle or a great victory, but with a child on a throne, in a kingdom surrounded by enemies who had to figure out very quickly how to survive in a world that wanted him dead. The almighty Qin Shi Huang dynasty. You need to understand what he was building it from. Because China before him was not a country. It was not even close to a unified civilization. It was a collection of 7 major kingdoms that had been fighting each other in various combinations and alliances for over 250 years. Historians call this period the Warring States period, and the name is accurate in the most literal and brutal sense. 7 kingdoms, Qin, Chu, Yan, Zhao, Wei, Han, and Qi, occupying the territory that would eventually become China, spending generation after generation in a state of near-continuous warfare. Children grew up in a world where the borders of their kingdom might change before they were adults, where the farmers in a field might be conscripted into an army before the harvest was finished, where the political alliance that guaranteed your kingdom's survival this year might dissolve next year and leave you exposed. This matters enormously for understanding what Qin Shi Huang eventually did, because the unification he achieved was not simply a military conquest. It was the end of a 250-year period of fragmentation and exhaustion that had cost the Chinese people an almost incomprehensible number of lives. When he unified China, he was not simply satisfying his own ambition. He was ending something that generations of people had been suffering through for longer than anyone alive could remember. The kingdom of Qin itself, before the unification, was considered by the other 6 kingdoms to be something of an outsider. Qin was in the west, in what is now Shanxi province, and it had a reputation as a somewhat crude and militaristic state compared to the more culturally sophisticated kingdoms of the East. The Qin people were seen by their rivals the way that some ancient Greeks looked at the Macedonians, capable fighters, but not quite fully civilized. This perception was a catastrophic mistake. What the other 6 kingdoms had failed to understand about Qin was not just that it was militarily strong. It was that Qin had reorganized its entire society around the principles of legalism in a more thorough and sustained way than any of the other kingdoms had managed. While other kingdoms still maintained significant power for old aristocratic families and relied on personal loyalty networks that shifted with marriages and deaths, Qin had built something more durable, a meritocratic bureaucracy where advancement depended on performance and loyalty to the state rather than on birth, an army where soldiers rose through the ranks based on what they achieved in battle, an economy where the rewards for productive work were clear and consistent. This sounds, described that way, almost admirable. And in some respects, it was. The problem with legalism, as Qin Shi Huang would demonstrate very clearly, is that the same system that rewards useful behavior also punishes any behavior the state defines as threatening with equal consistency and equal ruthlessness. A system with no room for mercy and no mechanism for forgiveness is efficient until the moment it starts eating its own people. And Qin Shi Huang's reign is, in many respects, the story of exactly that process. What Qin had, that none of the other kingdoms had managed to build as effectively, was a philosophy of governance called legalism. And understanding legalism is essential to understanding everything that follows, because it is the engine that drives the entire Qin story. Qin Shi Huang was born in 259 BC, and his childhood was not the comfortable, privileged upbringing you might expect for the heir to a powerful kingdom. His father was a Qin prince who had been given as a hostage to the rival kingdom of Zhao, a common diplomatic practice of the era, where kingdoms exchanged members of their royal families as insurance against betrayal. Growing up as a hostage in a foreign court, surrounded by people who had every reason to resent your kingdom and potentially harm you, is not a gentle education. When political circumstances changed and his father eventually returned to Qin and ultimately became king, the young prince came back to a court full of complex loyalties, factions, and the specific dangers that accompany power at every level of an ancient state. He was 13 years old when his father died, and he became king of Qin. 13 years old. King of one of the most powerful and militaristic kingdoms in the ancient world, surrounded by advisors and court factions, all pursuing their own interests, with 6 rival kingdoms watching for any sign of weakness. He survived. More than survived. Over the next 25 years, he outmaneuvered every rival, defeated every enemy, and did what none of his predecessors had managed to do. Between 230 and 221 BC, in a military campaign of extraordinary speed and coordination, he conquered all 6 of the remaining kingdoms one by one. In 221 BC, for the first time in Chinese history, there was one ruler over all of it. It is worth pausing here to understand the full weight of what that sentence means. The territory we are talking about is not small. The unified Qin Empire covered roughly what is now China's core historical heartland, an area of several million square kilometers, with a population estimated by historians at somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. Unifying this territory, imposing a single administrative system on it, and holding it together against the inevitable resistance of populations who had been enemies of Qin for generations, was a task of almost incomprehensible complexity. And he was 38 years old when he finished it. He did not call himself a king. The word for king, Wang, was the title his predecessors and his rivals had used. He invented a new title, Huangdi, usually translated as emperor, a title that combined the names of the mythological divine rulers of China's legendary past with the concept of supreme earthly authority. He was the first emperor, and in the number he added first was an ambition that should stop you cold. The dynasty he was founding, in his own vision of it, was going to last forever. What Qin Shi Huang built in the years after unification is one of the most ambitious administrative projects in human history, and it deserves to be understood in its full scope, rather than simply listed as a series of facts. Start with the writing system. Before unification, the Seven Kingdoms had developed their own variants of Chinese characters over centuries, to the point where a document written in one kingdom might be partially or completely unreadable by a literate person from another kingdom. Qin Shi Huang standardized the script. One set of characters, used the same way, across the entire empire. This is not a trivial achievement. Writing systems are deeply embedded in culture and habit. Changing them requires authority, enforcement, and time. He did it. Then, the currency. Seven kingdoms had 7 different monetary systems. Traders crossing borders had to constantly convert, calculate, and trust that foreign coins were what they claimed to be. Qin Shi Huang created a single imperial currency. Round coins with a square hole in the center, a design that would persist in Chinese coinage for over 2,000 years. Then, the roads. He built a network of imperial highways radiating out from his capital at Xianyang, connecting the far corners of the empire to the center. And critically, he standardized the axle widths of carts to match the width of these roads, so that any cart could travel any road in the empire without modification. This is the kind of detail that sounds mundane until you understand what it means for trade, for military logistics, for the movement of people and goods across a vast territory. He also standardized weights and measures. A unit of weight in one part of the empire was the same as a unit of weight in every other part. A unit of length meant the same thing everywhere. These standardizations are the invisible infrastructure that makes complex economies possible. This last action tells you something important about how Qin Shi Huang thought about power. Every measure he took was simultaneously a practical improvement and a consolidation of control. The roads made trade easier and also moved armies faster. The standardized writing made communication across the empire easier and also made it harder for regional identities to survive. The relocation of powerful families improved the capital and also neutralized potential threats. Every gift contained a surveillance mechanism. This is the essential character of the Qin system, and it is what makes Qin Shi Huang such a fascinating and troubling figure to study. He was not a simple tyrant who simply wanted power and hurt people to get it. He was a systematic thinker who had a specific vision of what a functioning empire looked like and pursued that vision with absolute consistency. The problem is that the vision itself contained within it the seeds of extraordinary cruelty. A system that makes control the highest value will always, eventually, find that the thing it most needs to control is the people inside it. The standardized writing system made communication possible across the empire. It also meant that anyone writing in the old regional scripts was implicitly illegitimate. The roads that allowed trade also allowed armies to suppress rebellion with speed. The relocated noble families from the conquered kingdoms could be monitored and managed rather than left in their home territories where old loyalties might reassert themselves. Every measure had 2 faces. Efficiency and control were not separate goals. They were the same goal. Now we come to the part of the story that the achievements cannot soften, because they are not separate from the achievements. They are the same story. The Great Wall, as we imagine it today, the continuous stone structure running across the mountains of northern China, is largely a product of the Ming Dynasty, built more than 1,000 years after Qin Shi Huang. But Qin Shi Huang did build walls. He connected and extended existing defensive walls along the northern frontier into something that functioned as a continuous barrier. And he did it by mobilizing hundreds of thousands of workers, soldiers, convicts, conscripted farmers, and pushing them through conditions that killed enormous numbers of them. Estimates of the death toll during Qin Wall construction are deeply uncertain, but they are large. Workers who died on the wall were sometimes buried within it. The wall was built from human cost as much as from earth and stone. Here is where the story takes a turn that is almost impossible to believe, except that the evidence for it is real. Qin Shi Huang was terrified of death. This is not a figure of speech. It was a genuine, consuming fear that shaped his behavior in ways that became increasingly irrational as he aged. He refused to speak the word for death in his presence. He moved between his many palaces, using secret tunnels and passageways so that no one could know which palace he was in on any given night, partly for security and partly out of a belief that unpredictability would protect him from fate itself. He sent expeditions to search for mythical islands where immortal beings were said to live, and where the elixir of immortality could be obtained. When those expeditions returned without the elixir, he sent more, and he drank mercury. His court alchemists had convinced him that liquid mercury, which they called flowing water silver, was connected to immortality. He consumed it in pills and potions. His final years were spent in a state of increasing physical deterioration that we can now recognize as chronic mercury poisoning. The tremors, the cognitive decline, the paranoia, the increasingly erratic decisions. He died in 210 BC on a tour of the eastern parts of his empire, still searching for the elixir of immortality, still refusing to accept that the death he had spent his reign trying to outrun had caught him. He was 49 years old. The mercury detail deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it is not simply a sad or ironic footnote to a great reign. It is the logical endpoint of everything that came before it. A man who believed that power over the physical world was essentially unlimited, who had standardized an entire civilization, who had moved hundreds of thousands of people across the empire at will, who had built a wall that stretched across mountains, who had ordered the destruction of centuries of accumulated human knowledge because he found it inconvenient, eventually confronted the one problem that power could not solve. He was going to die. And his response to that confrontation was entirely consistent with his response to every other problem he had faced. He threw resources at it. He applied systematic state power to it. He employed the best experts available, gave them whatever they needed, and demanded results. The alchemists who told him mercury would provide immortality were not lying to him out of malice. They genuinely believed what they were saying, within the cosmological framework of their time, in the same way that his administrators genuinely believed that burning books would produce stability. The tragedy is that the emperor who distrusted everything and everyone, who moved through secret passages and rotated between palaces to protect himself from assassination, who built an army of clay soldiers to protect him in death, that same emperor trusted completely the people, who were telling him that drinking a known poison would make him live forever. Sometimes the thing that kills you is not your enemy. It is the specific shape of your own deepest fear. The dynasty he believed would last 10,000 generations survived him by 18 months. His chosen successor was weak, manipulated by court officials, and faced immediate rebellions from the populations that had suffered most under Qin rule. Within 4 years of Qin Shi Huang's death, the empire had been overthrown and the Han Dynasty had begun. But here is what makes the story extraordinary, rather than simply tragic. The Han Dynasty, which replaced Qin, kept almost everything Qin Shi Huang had built. This is the fact that most histories of the Qin dynasty underemphasize, and it is arguably the most important fact in the entire story. When we talk about the fall of the Qin dynasty, we tend to focus on the speed and the drama of the collapse, the rebellions, the weak successor, the burning of the Qin capital by the forces that would establish the Han. It reads like a repudiation, like history rejecting what Qin had done and starting fresh. That is not what happened. The Han emperors who came to power in the aftermath of the Qin collapse inherited an empire that was already built. The infrastructure was there. The administrative framework was there. The concept of centralized imperial rule was there. The standardized writing system, the currency, the roads, all of it was still there, still functioning, still the mechanism through which a vast and diverse territory was being governed. What the Han changed was the ideological justification. The Qin had governed through legalism, strict, consistent, ruthless. The Han moved toward a synthesis that incorporated Confucian values of moral governance, benevolence, and the importance of ritual and education, alongside the legalist structural apparatus that made the empire actually function. It was, in modern terms, a change of management philosophy rather than a change of operating system. The operating system was Qin, the standardized writing, the currency, the roads, the administrative system, the concept of a unified China governed by a single emperor. All of it survived the dynasty that created it. The Han emperors who came after Qin Shi Huang rejected the harshest elements of legalism, softened the punishments, and made room for other schools of thought, particularly Confucianism, which the Qin had suppressed. But the structural framework of imperial China that they governed through was the framework Qin Shi Huang had built. Every dynasty that ruled China for the next 2,000 years, Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing, was governing through institutions and systems that traced their origin to the 11 years of the Qin dynasty and the vision of one man who died drinking mercury at 49. But the China that exists today, its sense of itself as a unified civilization with a continuous history, its written language, the very concept of what China is built on foundations that Qin Shi Huang laid. He wanted to erase everything that came before him and replace it with himself. He failed at that. What actually happened is stranger and in some ways more remarkable. He was erased by what he built, absorbed into the larger story of Chinese civilization that continued without him. The first emperor wanted to be the beginning of everything. He ended up being the foundation that everything else was built on top of. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is the whole story of what power can and cannot do.